You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96 with Melinda Francis, Norman Richmond, and Lisa Watson is on the buttons, and joining us on the line from somewhere in the world is Dr. Gerald Horne. Dr. Gerald Horne, the author of dozens of books. His most current volume is The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800 to 1865. And Dr. Horne has been traveling around with the with his book, the new book, and I'm dying to hear before we talk about the topic, the topics of the day. How has the tour been going, and how was the launch of your book? And how's it coming so far?
So far, so good. I was in Montgomery College in Silver Spring, Maryland, right across the border from Washington, D.C. this past Friday, and in Brooklyn, New York, the week before that. But let me take the opportunity to introduce a number of points that I think the audience would be interested in. Starting tomorrow, there will be a 3-day session in Beijing to plan the next 5-year plan. Now, this is remarkable for a number of reasons. Capitalist propaganda has suggested that 5-year plans and indeed socialism itself do not work. Now, with the rise of China, what we can now infer is that socialism doesn't work very well when capitalism is trying to sabotage it. That's really the lesson that you should take away. And in fact, what's notable about what's happening today is how U.S. imperialism under pressure has begun to a degree imitate China. You know that the U.S. has taken major stakes in huge corporations. I'm thinking of Intel, for example, which you can find in terms of their chips in many computers as we speak. The same holds true for U.S. Steel, for example. And this is an indication, it seems to me, how the global correlation of forces is shifting. However, before you uncork the bottles of champagne, I should mention as well that there are some tendencies in China we need to pay attention to. Number one, there have been significant purges, ousters of leading military men. And we know that the military plays a huge role in China. The People's Liberation Army, for example, is not an arm of the state, it's an arm of the party. And in fact, when Deng Xiaoping, who presided over the accelerated rise of China, albeit by dint of an alliance with U.S. imperialism beginning in the 1970s, his only title was head of the Central Military Commission. He was not head of the party. He was not head of state or head of government. I should also mention that the current issue of The Economist, and this may be worth investigation, reports on a number of captains of industry in China are committing suicide. I guess you could call that self-liquidation. And a number of others are being detained. I'm not sure what to make of that. That is taking place on the eve of the formulation of the next 5-year plan, October 20th to 23rd, but certainly it's worthy of note. Also worthy of note is the fact that Ashley Keller, an influential Indian American, that is to say with roots in South Asia, has been arrested by the U.S. authorities, although he was seen as a prominent member of the U.S. ruling elite. This is quite serious, and it may also augur a further downturn in relations between New Delhi and Washington, which was already on the agenda. Recall Mr. Modi, the prime minister, making his first trip to China in 7 years just a few weeks ago. Recall the pressure placed by Mr. Trump on India to stop buying Russian petroleum. So this relationship between India and the United States, which many thought would be critical in terms of encircling China, now seems to be called into question. And finally, in terms of preliminary notes, keep an eye on deteriorating relations between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Already, as you know, there is discontent in Tigray. Recall what happened in the last few years, the conflict between this prominent province of Ethiopia and the central government. And given the fact of the close ties between Tigray and Eritrea, in fact, Isaias, the leader of Eritrea, his mother is said to be Tigrayan, for example. And given the discontent in Tigray, given the fact that Abiy Ahmed, the prime minister of Ethiopia, has said that Ethiopia needs an outlet to the sea, and therefore he seems to be casting his eyes upon the ports on the Red Sea, now controlled by Eritrea. So this is potentially a very significant, and given the fact that Egypt, going back centuries, has a bone to pick with Ethiopia, it cannot be ruled out that they will seek to stir the pot of discontent as well.
I have a question for you, Dr. Horne. Do you see China as some people maintain that China is a state capitalist state? It's not a socialist state, it's state capitalism. Where do you stand on that?
Well, I mean, certainly there are capitalist enterprises in China. I mean, look at Huawei, for example. I mean, look at TikTok and ByteDance, et cetera. But there's no question that the commanding heights of the Chinese economy are not in private hands. Speaking of the banks, speaking of electricity, speaking of the railways, for example, certainly the Communist Party of China cannot be easily characterized as a capitalist formation. So I think that oftentimes in terms of developing a typology, many of our friends, they don't know what to make of a penguin. That is to say, is a penguin fish or fowl? Is it a bird, etc.? That is to say, there are hybrid formations, and we have to understand that the way China evolved, as we've mentioned repeatedly, as a result of this de facto alliance with US imperialism against the Soviet Union, it helped to lead to the development of these capitalist enterprises. At the same time, as we know, many Maoists on this side of the Pacific were charging that state capitalism was developing the Soviet Union and China was standing tall against same, but that's another story for another day. So the sum of substance is that I know that there are people who are trying to avoid getting on the bad side of US imperialism. That is to say, they want not necessarily to anger US imperialism, which now has a vendetta against China. So they're looking for any excuse to diss China, to dismiss China, etc. But I'm afraid to say they'll get no assistance from yours truly.
We had a demonstration in Toronto against the king and no king situation. I guess that's what we wanted to kick off with. That how did you see those demonstrations all across the United States? There was a big quite a successful one here in Toronto. I guess they were probably taking places in other parts of the world. Could you talk about the No Kings protests?
Well, in Toronto, I take it No Kings was not the name of the protest. Is that correct?
Melinda, was that the name of it?
I think so.
Because
which is a little ironic, I know. Yeah.
You have a king, which brings me to the point. I understand the sentiment of the liberals who decided to affix the slogan "No Kings" to this mass protest, which brought millions to the streets, not only in the United States, but in North America, in Western Europe, etc. they were trying to make a statement against the authoritarianism of Mr. Trump, against these really despicable raids against immigrant populations, which, by the way, have been leading to what might be called collateral damage. Some might even call it intended damage against the Black community. For example, look at the coverage of the National Guard and the immigration authorities in Chicago. As a matter of fact, there's a quote in the New York Times today where a young Black man seeing what's happening says, and I paraphrase, "I thought you people were supposed to be choking Mexicans, not Black Americans." And I think that sort of sums it up. But I recall the No Kings protest in June 2025. Recall I was in Victoria, British Columbia then, taking the ferry every Saturday to Port Angeles, Washington, a sleepy little town. And I recall getting off the ferry in mid-June 2025 and encountering a significant No Kings protest. And I recall from the coverage that our Canadian friends did not like the necessary name No King, since, of course, your head of state is King Charles III, no less, and gave it another name. Perhaps they decided to roll with the punches this time. But in any case, I think that this title, No Kings, it represents a certain kind of confusion, for example, because Canada, by many measures, is more progressive than the United States of America. It has single-payer health care, for example, and yet it has a king. So perhaps they might have wanted to have a more controversial title like No Immigrant Bashing, No White Supremacy, Heaven Forfend, No Imperialism, No Capitalism, for example. But I think that they're trying to feed into the 1776 mania, which the United States is already enduring as we mark the 200th anniversary of the revolt against British rule. But I think what it should cause them to do is to interrogate 1776, as we've been doing on these airwaves and before microphones and in print for years now. But that does not seem to be in the offing. And even some of our friends on the left have criticized me because I suggested that people participate in these protests. And some of the friends on the left were saying I was in a contradiction because obviously the whole idea of no kings in 1776 is not something I've smiled upon. But in any case, I think what it reflects, at least on my part, an attempt at steering clear of sectarianism. I mean, I'm not going to wait around for millions to agree with me on the nature of the creation of the United States of America before I endorse and push and promote a multi-million person protest against Agent Orange, Mr. Trump, and neo-fascism.
Well, I'll say this and then we'll move on. But Charles Roach was a lot of people. I have a friend of mine, late Sankara Leach, who was he was in the CP at one point. He and Charles Roach differed on. Charles Roach didn't want anybody to pledge allegiance to the Queen or the King or whatever. And people were basically saying, Charles could do that. Charles Roach was a great lawyer in Toronto, a very close friend of mine, and Gerald you know him very well as well. And people were arguing that Charlie had money, he was quite well off, and he was telling people not to swear allegiance to the crown, and other people who were like on the left were basically saying that Charles can do that because Charles is well off, but I'm going to take that. I don't know. What do you say that? I have to make that compromise, because I want to be able to live in Canada and not get deported for a traffic ticket, if that makes any sense.
I understand the point you're making.
Melinda, do you have any more questions?
Yeah, did we want to go to the next thing? Where do we want to go next? Yeah. Otani? Yeah.
Well, sure. I mean, I know that they're not there's not necessarily an audience of baseball fans on Diasporic music, but I feel compelled to give a shout out to the Japanese stars, Mr. Ohtani, who is quite remarkable as an athlete. He plays for the Los Angeles Dodgers baseball team. And there was a pivotal game just this past Friday where he executed a feat rarely, if ever seen, in the 150-year history of professional baseball. In baseball, there are some who excel at throwing the ball. They're called pitchers. And there are some who excel at hitting the ball. They're sluggers or hitters. Mr. Ohtani is that rare breed. He excels at both. In a championship game this past Friday, he basically was outstanding as a pitcher and outstanding as a slugger, hitting 3 home runs and pitching 6 scoreless innings. And so that's worthy of contemplation, how it is that this game, which is developed in the North Atlantic, speaking of baseball, with roots in Britain, but flourishing in the United States, and now, of course, Toronto, the Blue Jays, are in the playoffs as well, playing Seattle, although things don't look very good for them. But the point that I'm making is that this game developed in the North Atlantic, perhaps the best player of all time comes out of Japan. And there is a lesson there that likely is applicable to other fields and other enterprises.
Let me ask you. I'm sorry. Had you completed your thought, Dr. Horne?
Yes.
Let me ask you this: the Japanese are a special type of people because I can't figure out how in terms of technology and the brain of the science and all that kind of type of thing. The Japanese are top of the line, but also culturally, the Japanese have great jazz musicians. They have hip hop artists. You have doo-wop groups. You have reggae bands. How do you see that?
Well, let me take the opportunity to mention that the next book I'll publish, entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1893, The Hawaii Coup and the Roots of U.S. Imperialism, the Asia-Pacific Basin, has a starring role for not only Japan, but the Japanese who lived in Hawaii beginning in the late 19th century, because the Hawaiian monarch was trying to broker an alliance with Japanese royalty and the Japanese state in order to foil the U.S. takeover. And in fact, as I suggest in this book, when you look at the modernity of Japan, which in many ways breaks the European and North Atlantic stranglehold on modernity, that in some ways, Japan, beginning in the 1860s, was following the Hawaiian monarch as opposed to vice versa. And I think that since that period, you have seen a remarkable rise. And of course, we talked many times about how when Japan defeated Russia in 1904, this was celebrated by Du Bois, by Nehru, by Ho Chi Minh, by Sun Yat-sen of China, etc., because they recognized it was a significant breakthrough. And of course, as we've talked about many times in the past, many Black nationalists attached themselves to Tokyo as well. I well remember living in Zimbabwe when Japanese delegations, particularly aid workers, would arrive for their job. They'd get off the plane and begin singing in perfect pitch the Zimbabwean national anthem. Now, many of the Zimbabweans didn't know the Zimbabwean national anthem, for example. So this is quite a remarkable story in terms of global history, and it's not meant to avoid a critique of either imperial Japan or imperialist Japan, particularly today with the rise of the Iron Lady, Prime Minister in waiting Takaichi, the impending alliance with Indian nationalists, which we've talked about on this program, which does not bode well for the continued ascendancy and rise of Beijing. But in any case, once again, on this program, we're trying to not necessarily take one-sided points of view. We're trying to take all-sided points of view, and most of all, trying to apprise the audience of facts and realities so that they can develop their own analysis.
We have a situation where this is a serious situation. Can we talk about the overthrow of the Voting Rights Act? That's serious as a heart attack, wouldn't you say?
Well, sure. It was in 1965 that the U.S. Congress, under tremendous global and domestic pressure, passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And the United States oftentimes brags about being a so-called democracy, but most Black people didn't get the right to vote until 1965. But now, with the rise of Trumpism, the rise of neo-fascism, the rise of the right wing, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is slated, it seems, for overthrow, which would be a major blow to not only Black political power, but also to progressive political power, because even though, listening to some of our friends on the left, they would suggest it shouldn't matter what the ancestry is of your representative. Well, it does matter, because there's a confluence between ancestry, or what's euphemistically called race, and politics. That is to say that settler descendants tend to lean to the right, and descendants of enslaved Africans tend to lean to the left. That's a simple reality that any school child should be able to acknowledge, but somehow it has escaped the attention of many of our friends on the left. And now many of us will have to pay a price, because that sort of boneheaded thinking has contributed to this neo-fascist attempt to overthrow the Voting Rights Act. And I should also critique many of the liberals who thought they were being quite wise and cagey by throwing those to their left overboard in order to cut a deal with the U.S. ruling class to get the Voting Rights Act of 1965 through Congress and onto the desk of President Johnson for signing. But now we see that that was a short-sighted decision, that you cannot necessarily depend upon the U.S. ruling class to keep a bargain and to keep a deal, which is what China is pointing to as we speak. And so now it seems that there is going to be a considerable amount of time wandering in the desert, so to speak, of the progressive community and the Black community, which intersect at certain points if this Voting Rights Act is overturned. And if it's overturned, it'll likely be announced in June of 2026.
You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. You have some more questions, Melinda?
Yeah. Do we want to go to the ASEAN and APEC summit?
Well, just like we announced to begin with, the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party developing the next 5-year plan beginning October 20th. In the next week or so, you'll see a summit of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and you'll also see the summit of APEC, Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. Mr. Trump is expected to attend the latter. I assume that Prime Minister Mark Carney will be present in Seoul, South Korea for the latter as well. It's suspected that Mr. Trump will also attend the ASEAN summit, which is quite notable. I think it has something to do with the fact that ASEAN has become a major locomotive for the Chinese economy. That is to say, as the United States and China decouple, a lot of Chinese investment is being shifted to Indonesia, to Thailand, to Malaysia, etc. Not to mention the fact that the Philippines, the former U.S. colony, is being slated to be at the tip of the spear being held by U.S. imperialism. And so do not be surprised that Mr. Trump pitches up in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, for the ASEAN summit. And I should also mention something that's little known, which is that I have knowledge of the fact that there is a growing Black American colony, if I can use that term, or expatriate population, to be more precise, in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. And as the person who has visited there some years ago, I can understand why that's the case, because it's very pleasant weather. Your currency will probably tide you over quite well. And of course, the cuisine is spectacular. So keep your eyes on Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and whether or not there is a mini summit taking place between Mr. Trump and Chinese leaders there.
Can we talk about the new Raoul Peck documentary, please?
Yeah, when I was in Washington, I managed to go see his new work, Orwell, 2 + 2 = 5. Your audience is probably familiar with George Orwell, or at least familiar with the adjective oftentimes invoked, Orwellian. He was British, born in what was then British Burma. He, of course, was a noted writer. You may be familiar with his works Animal Farm in 1984. I have to confess up front that I have not been a fan of George Orwell. Of course, he's a hero to many liberals. There might be a connection between my refusing to join fandom and us being a hero of liberals. And so I was rather stunned that Raoul Peck, the former Haitian Minister of Culture, perhaps our most noted filmmaker, you may be familiar with his works, the docudrama Lumumba, the docudrama The Young Karl Marx, which I think is at the apex not only of his work, but global cinema, and not to mention his documentary, Exterminate All the Brutes, which he was able to place on HBO. And it's quite remarkable, a slashing castigation of settler colonialism, which is something, that is to say, that concept are rarely invoked, even by our friends on the left, the United States, who consider themselves to be ultra sophisticates. And so, even though Orwell 2 + 2 = 5 was well done, as you can say for all of Mr. Peck's work, well researched, the kind of footage he was able to uncover is quite notable. I think in some ways it does not reach the summit, the pinnacle of his previous work, although I would still recommend that those who are fans of Raoul Peck see this documentary. It's probably playing in Toronto, it's probably playing in Los Angeles, etc.
You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. Can we talk about can you talk about Madagascar?
Well, the coup has taken place. We have been anticipating a coup. Now, some of my confidants have been suggesting that this explosion of so-called Gen Z protests, we saw it in Nepal, we see it in Morocco, we see it in now Madagascar, that there is possibly something suspicious about it, given what we know about so-called color revolutions, whereby the US and their minions get behind mass discontent and then try to channel that mass discontent in a pro-imperialist fashion. I am not able to say if that's what's unfolding in Madagascar as we speak. I am able to say that the deposed leader, he departed the country on French transport, which may be a signal, France being the erstwhile neo-colonial force in Madagascar. And in fact, here's a tip to budding scholars in our audience. Somebody needs to write a book in English. There have been a number of works in French on what happens in Madagascar in 1947, when the French colonialists massacred hundreds of thousands of anti-colonial forces. It's quite a story that is not as well known, for example, as the Indonesian massacre that we talked about in 1965, that took place in 1965, which we talked about last week. not to mention Rwanda genocide, not to mention the genocide against the indigenous. And of course, as we noted a few days ago, not only is it suspected that the great Muhammad Ali may have had roots in that Southeast African nation, that is to say, it's off the coast of Mozambique. Andy Razaf, who of course is a noted lyricist and composer, who I'm sure many of your audience are familiar with, R-A-Z-A-F, spent considerable time in Los Angeles. Its roots were directly in Madagascar. In fact, what happens is that with the alliance between Black American elites and the Republican Party in the late 1890s, a Republican administration dispatched a Black American by the name of John Waller, served as a low-level diplomat in Madagascar, and emerging from that particular stationing was Andy Razaf. So that is to say, being born there as a result of a union between those of Black American descent and Malagasy or Madagascan descent. So in any case, that's the state of play with regard to what's happening in Southeast Africa.
Madagascar is, Ain't Misbehaving. That's the brother's song, right?
Correct.
Yeah, Ain't Misbehaving. That's classic, right? Yeah. I think, is there anything else you would like to add? We have a minute left, sir.
Tell me, did Andy Razaf do also What Did I Do to Be So Black and Blue, or was that someone else?
I knew Satchmo sang it, but I think it might have been him. I think he did have something to do with that. I'm gonna look that up as soon as I get off the air. But we can talk about that next week. Yeah, Satchmo is famous for singing. That's one of his songs, right?
That is correct. Louis Armstrong, New Orleans. The airport in New Orleans, by the way, is named after Louis Armstrong, believe it or not. He is noted for singing that particular song. And yes, lyrics by Andy Razaf and music by Fats Waller. And of course, that's a classic of the genre. And so a shout out to the late Andy Razaf as your homeland, Madagascar, goes through straits and turmoil.
And Satchmo was a great, I understand he had tape recorders all over the place. He was a great researcher. He considered himself a Ghanaian. I mean, he said he was from the Gold Coast. I think he was even before Ghana was independent, Satchmo was there. He was there in maybe 50, 55, 54. Then he went back and had a great relationship with Osajifo, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, and a lot of the Ghanaians. But I'm talking to the converted because you wrote all about that, right?
I did research at the Louis Armstrong Museum in Queens, New York, which of course has its archives, and it's a great place to do research.
All right, thank you, sir. So we'll be hollering at you again next week.
Good luck to you.
And Melinda Francis, anything else you would like to add before we thank Lisa and get off the air?
Yeah, I hope all our listeners are able to stay safe throughout the week, and we'll see everybody in the whirlwind.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.